just about a year ago, New Year's Eve. I had left the women's dance I had been at. It was making me feel, I should say, worse than I might have felt otherwise. And so I was going to take the sea bus back home to the North Shore. And, you know, if you don't or whatever, the sea bus is in the big, huge ex-Canadian National terminal down there, you know, the big red brick building, and very monumental. And as I was walking in, close to midnight, I see this homeless fellow reading, sitting in the sort of windowsill. They have those probably 12-foot high windows and deep windowsills. And he's sitting there clutching like this, a book, a large book, very crisp one. And I just struck me. There's this homeless guy reading this, you know, thick new book. And so I start going into the station, and I see I've got about 5.5 minutes to the next ferry. They do run every 15 minutes. And so I've got about 5.5 minutes, but I think to myself, you know, he can see now with the light from inside, but they're going to close this thing down in a couple of hours, and he won't be able to keep reading. He won't have the light. And I had one of those little LED keychain lights. And so I went back. I put a couple of toonies with it, and I went back to him just outside there, and I said, here, you might be able to use a light. He said, oh, I got plenty of light. I said, well, okay, but, you know, maybe later or whatever. And I couldn't help it. I was just, by then I knew I'd missed the 5-minute one, and I was simply curious about why he was there, what he was reading. Usually I don't really ask people. I figure it's invasive of their privacy, but, you know, it's New Year, so you know we're going to be. So I said, what's a book? And he says, it's a biography of Katherine Hepburn. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because I was just down at my sister's, and I was reading this pictorial book about Katherine Hepburn. So I'm very glad we had this connection. And so I said, well, what do you think of her? What do you think of her? And he said, she's very interesting, very distinctive person, and I think she was very strong. She was very strong. She didn't sort of go for that kind of studio, you know, the long hair and the fancy clothes. And I said, you mean the sort of femme fatale thing of the day? He said, yeah, she didn't go for that. And she was really quite strong and self-sufficient. He said you'd almost see her as maybe a little masculine, you know, like a gay woman. As a gay woman, I tried to let that pass. And but actually, I saw what he meant, and particularly in that time, gay women didn't have husbands to take care of them, right? And so he was struck by the fact that she seemed to be quite self-sufficient. And I said, well, and the interesting thing, too, is that she spent all that time, that very long relationship, with Spencer Tracy. And he said, yeah, he's an ugly guy, and he was a drunk. And I said, yeah, and you wonder in the relationship whether you would see all that time together, and Spencer Tracy, of course, was married all that time, whether you would see that as a strength or a weakness for her. And he said, well, I think what it was is she liked to help people. And for instance, he says Judy Garland, that there in the studio, what Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer did with her is basically they got her on pills to wake her up and pills to make her go to sleep. They made her become an addict. And that at some point, Katherine Hepburn did try to help with that. We both knew nothing helped, and eventually Judy did commit suicide. But, you know, we had that kind of discussion. And it was interesting as we were talking, and I noticed that while he did have homeless sort of clothes, and he had a little cart nearby, but not with bottles and cans, just a cart, that his clothes, yes, they were filthy and all of that, but his face was very clean. He had quite a handsome face. His face was very clean. His teeth were good, and he had a very carefully managed just mustache and chin beard. You know, it was sort of not, in a sense, what you often see with homeless people, but in any case, it was just interesting sort of contrast to me. And as we're standing there, this group of young women go by laughing away and everything, and they're, you know, they've got this, even though it's cold and wet, they've got the skirts up to here, you know, and then the leggings and the whatever, I don't even know what you call those things, you know, and you sort of can tell. And in any case, and you know, the high heels up to here, And I said, and he said, he looks at them too and he says, it's so cold and they're so young. And I said something like, well, partying, you probably don't feel it. And he said, thinking of partying, he said, it's New Year's Eve, how come you're here? And I said, well, I was at this women's dance, and it just somehow, sometimes I get depressed, you know, like it just makes me sad. And I say to myself, I mean, what am I doing here? And he said, I ask myself that a lot. What am I doing here? And I thought, now I'm going to hear the story of how he became homeless. But he was asking it, as you'll see, at a much deeper level than that. He said, I asked myself that a lot. In 2003, my wife died. And for the next 5 years, I fell apart. I did everything to harm myself, everything that you shouldn't do. He said, I tried to kill myself 4 times. Once he tried to hang himself from a tree in Central Park, 30 feet up, and the branch broke. He tried another time to hang himself. He tried with drugs, and he tried to jump. And none of those worked. And so he asks himself, why am I here? And his answer to himself was that God must have a purpose for him. And I didn't get the feeling this guy is some religious zealot, but he had to explain it, and he said that God must have had a reason for that, and he felt that the reason was for him to save a great person. And I said, well, it seems to me like saving any person would be a good thing. But he said, no, a great person, and for him, clearly it was a trade-off, right? It was 4 of his lives, or 4 of his near deaths, would be an equivalent in saving one great person. And so I then noticed that it was about time for me to catch the next sea bus. So I said to him, I gotta be going, and he said, thanks for spending the time. And he reached out his hand, and he said, my name's Rob. And so I said, Marylee, and I reached my hand out, but I couldn't shake his hand because his hand was so gnarled in a sense. It was so like permanently formed with calluses, probably with dirt, with the kind of work he probably had to do, you know, whether it was pipe fitting or any number of things. It wouldn't, so I could just lay my hand in his like that. And then as I moved away, he said, not really to me, but sort of to the air, he said, your hands are so warm. And as I was walking away, I thought, well, we had a good book club talk. We had a good warm touch. That was a good New Year's after all, and maybe it bodes well for the year to come. Thank you.